Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. We're just gonna give a couple minutes to see if we get any stragglers. So we'll be starting like in a minute or two. All right, so we're gonna get started. Welcome everyone again to the Downtown React Meetup. Today's presentations will be on React with TypeScript and also domain modeling with React by our guest today, Aidan. Before we get started though, I want to walk you through some kind of like development news for front end. I'm trying to do this every meetup, just go through some stuff that I found online that was recommended through some friends and even through the meetup that I think we as front end developers can find very useful as we level up our skill set. Let me share my screen. So not too long ago, Airbnb came out with a Visual X or VisX type of a collection of React components, which if you follow Airbnb, they have a pretty impressive development engineering team. And so I really enjoyed going to this gallery here. It's very low level visualizations of graphs, bar graphs, charts, animations, and it's used with D3. So I just started using D3, and so this is great motivation to keep learning it and also to, I guess, get examples on how we can build certain animation in the front end, which is great. And so they have a massive gallery that they have open source and are sharing it with the community, right? So this is something, if you're working on charts, you're thinking about working on charts, you're thinking about going to animations, starting D3, Really encourage you to take a peek at this. It's really awesome. I really enjoyed it, and it's something definitely I'll be using very soon in my projects. Another interesting news that came out, React 17. It's in release candidacy right now, but if you're new to React or already in the game of React, it wouldn't hurt, right, to stay on top of what's going on, what will be coming pretty damn soon, because it is at React 17 release candidate 2, I believe. And one of the new things that they promoted was this JSX transform. Essentially, what it is whenever we write JSX, we're always importing the library React at the very top, and that's just because of the compilation of the JSX into a React create element. And so what this React 17 will be doing is pretty much saying you don't need to import React, right? You can literally just write your JSX, and in the background, when you compile your JSX, it kind of just wraps itself in a, as you see here, in a kind of JSX runtime, right? So whether you use create React app or you kind of just import your own libraries, this is a nice little trick you can start using. Again, it's React 17 release candidate 2. If you stay in on top with the React stuff, React 17, as the React team kind of mentioned, it's not completely promotion of new features in React 17. It's more like cleaning up and optimizations. And one of those things is a new JSX transform. And so that's pretty much it that I had as far as showing off front-end development. If you have any suggestions, if you have any links, any blog posts that you found very informative that you want to share with the community, let me know and we'll get it out there the next time around. And so for our first talk, going into the presentations, our first talk will be by Aidan Garza. He's doing a talk on coding a domain model. And so I will hand off the reins to him.
Thanks, Roberto. Hi, everybody. Excited to be sharing with y'all today. Just share my screen real quick. All right. I'm not seeing it come up just yet. There we go. All right, awesome. Okay, so the domain model. So we'll go over a couple things here. So first, who am I? And we'll talk about what the domain model is and why it's important. And then I can give a quick demo on one way that I've implemented it in my projects in the past. And hopefully that can be beneficial to some of y'all who already have projects going or have new ones getting started. And there's code up on GitHub for all of this. The sample, the demo, and these slides will all be available to everybody afterwards to check out. And then we can answer some questions. So who am I? I'm Aidan Garza Sr. I'm the principal engineer at Homeward, which is a startup here in Austin. I've been building React apps since version 0.7. So a while, seen all the transformations that have happened. It's been fun. Gotta say, I like the direction. And then there's my LinkedIn link if anybody wants to connect afterwards. Again, the slides will be shared. So what is a domain model? Kind of the most basic definition that I can give is that it's the nouns in an application and their relationships. So the things that you're actually interacting with. When somebody comes to you with a business problem, somebody wants you to build a car, you start working out the parts. And that's the domain models, working out the parts, the nouns that make up the solution. It's most commonly represented by a class diagram when you're doing technical design. So, your enumeration of classes and all the arrows that connect them and their properties, those are representative of the domain model. There's some other diagrams that can also represent it, but this is definitely the most common. And you can simplify it even lower than a full-on class diagram, as I'll do in a little bit. So for this to-do list app, which is the demo app that I made for us today, you see there's this list, and then the list has items, and then those items have a name and maybe some labels. So we can translate that into this diagram that shows those items and their relationships. So a list is made up of items. It aggregates items. And then an item can be associated to a label. And then we can even name those interactions, like a list item or an item label. And those names are important, but we'll get into that later. So for this app, which is the last company that I worked for, a much more complex app than a to-do app, this is what my domain model looked like. And it's always important to me to maintain an actual diagram like this, so that everybody can be on the same page about what it is that you've built. So anytime I had a new developer start, I could hand this to them, and they already knew what our database was going to look like and what our microservice architecture was going to look like. And all the names that are in this diagram are the same names as the database tables and the same names as the component structures in the front end. So it gave us a common language. And again, we'll talk about that later. So it's iterative and refactorable. This list right here, or this picture right here, didn't always look that way. It became that way over time. And even here, you can see that one of the microservices, or one of the insights item was deprecated. So it's going to change, and it's going to be refactored over time as your understanding of the problem improves. So this that we saw before could become this. Maybe we decide to make this new label group concept so that each list has its own labels to choose from. And as we better understand the problem and the items that we're dealing with, it will change. And changing it consistently as a team is important. So why is it important? So first of all, it serves as a vital link between the real world and the code. So like we just said, if you're building a car, you've got a steering wheel and a chassis and tires and wheels, and all of those things are real. When you're modeling how a car works, if you're building the computer that drives a car, it needs to be aware of those things. And the best way to make sure that you know what your code is doing is to actually name the real world things as they are, and that'll make it the most understandable. It's highly visual and understandable by both technical and non-technical teams. So these diagrams that we've been seeing, you could hand those to somebody with zero programming experience, and they could look at it and basically understand what's going on and the things that you're talking about and how they're related. But it also can provide even more understanding for the technical parts of teams. It also, as I mentioned before, provides a common vocabulary that can improve communication and efficiency. So if I say item, a list item, and the backend developers say list item, and the product team says list item, and the designer says list item, and we're all using that same vocabulary, then when the designer comes to me with a change, then we can all know that we're talking about the same thing. I know it happens very frequently that one team will name something slightly different than the other team, and now you have to have a translation between everybody that takes time and causes confusion. Which leads to this: it reduces tribal knowledge for easier onboarding and better maintainability. So anytime a new member joins the team and somebody from a different part of the team is referring to something in the domain model, they know what they're talking about. They can go look it up in the code directly without having to get somebody who has been on the team for longer than them to translate what they're talking about. And better maintainability for the same reason. It's easy to look things up because you're not constantly having to remember what you changed something to or what something actually means. So now I hope that all made sense, and we're moving into how it can be implemented. So how do we turn this diagram into your actual code? And I created this demo app that again will be available to everybody afterwards. But here's what it looks like. So just like from the screenshot before, you've got this simple thing where we can add. We've got a list that we can add items to. So say ice cream, and then you can add labels to items. So it's dairy and it's cold. And then eventually you can mark things as complete, and you can add whole new lists. So stuff to pack. Socks, which are clothes, and brush, which is toiletry. So there we go. It's pretty simple. We've got three major things that we're working with here. We've got the list, we've got the items in the list, and then we've got the labels. So when it comes time to actually code this, the first thing that I've done to get this domain model into my code is to actually create a models directory in my source directory. And location doesn't necessarily matter, but I like it to be at the root and be important. And then I create a model, create a JavaScript class for each thing. So in this case, so we'll start at the top. So list, here's the list. That's part of a demo later. Here's the list, and every list has an ID and a name. So that's pretty simple. And you can make it to where you can instantiate it with nothing in it, and it'll create an empty one. It gives you a lot of flexibility as things change, and as this model changes to change it and maintain it in a good way. So here's the list model with an ID and a name. And then and if anybody has questions about this, I tend to like to create add a static create function that returns a frozen version, just so that when I'm getting things back from the database, they're essentially immutable. But we don't have to dive into that today. And then here's the item. So an item has an ID, a name, some label names associated with it, whether or not it's complete, and then the list ID that it belongs to. And again, this is very simple, where we're just pretty much taking each property and assigning it directly. And but you could just as easily do define properties and pick which ones are enumerable or writable or readable, and all of the power that a class gives you. And then a label, which has a name and a color. So there we go. So what this does more than anything is anybody who's joining the team can come on and look at these models and say, right away, okay, I know what a list is and I know what its properties are. And they can really quickly see the content of, or the items that your app is dealing with. And for this project, this is actually using the latest React Redux template for Create React App. And this is the default setup that it gives you with an app directory with the store, a features directory, and we can talk about that in a second. And so this is the default configuration for the new React Redux template in Create React App. And features line up almost perfectly with the domain model. And there are going to be some areas where that isn't necessarily the case, but for the most part, they do. And whenever something does line up, my recommendation is to use the naming convention that you set. So if I've got an item model, I've got an items feature. If I've got a label model, I've got a labels feature, and so on. And there's other ways, obviously other ways, and everybody has preferences for their directory organization. But even if you're, using a page-based organization or a functional-based organization, you can still use naming conventions that line up with the models to make understanding better. So let's look at an example here. So if we look at the lists, it's got its own Redux slice. I've added some fixtures just for the sake of the demo with some sample data. And then if I look here at components, I'm still using the same sort of naming convention where list components are specified with the word lists. So let's look at a list section. And one of the really cool things that creating each domain item as a model, as a class is in here, in this component, when it accepts a list prop that it's going to render, I can check with prop types if it's an instance of list. And right away, I know anybody that comes in knows exactly what sort of thing this component is expecting and what its properties are, because they can go and look up list. So there's no more creating a ton of different shapes and maintaining every time you add a property to something, updating shapes across the entire app. It definitely makes it nice and consistent. And now I always know what is going to be inside of list. So if list is properly instantiated, then I know that it's going to have a name. I don't have to do a lot of checks for whether or not properties exist, or a lot of backup verification that something is there when I should just expect it to be there. So just as an example of how simple it might be to modify an item in the domain model. So right now we have a list and then items and then labels on an item. But we could just as easily add labels to lists as well. So if I go to my list model, say label names, which would be an empty string if none are provided, or empty array if none are provided. And there we go. Now everywhere I'm using this list object, I am getting a label names property that's an empty array if nothing was provided. So if I go back into this list section component and I want to see those labels, I already have a nice resource labels component that renders labels from a list, from a label names property on something. So we'll just do resource labels. Item is my list. And here's an example of where I could have used better naming. If I've got resource labels, then this could just be resource to be more, to be less specific. But right away, I've added this resource labels, and I beforehand went and added, oh no, I didn't. Okay, here we go. So grocery list. So now we're going to add to our sample data. Before I do anything, let's go look at what it looks like. So nothing really has changed yet. And now if I go and add label names, and I happen to know that I already created a label called home. When I come back here, I've got my label rendering. And obviously there'd be more work to do to make them addable and removable. But I mean, just look how simple it was because of the naming convention and because of that root, or because of the use of that model class, that list class, to be able to put this in so quickly. So again, this is available. This is up in GitHub and available for anybody to check out. So I definitely invite you to do so. All right, so just to summarize what I just talked about, typically I create a class for each domain model element in a models directory at the root of my project source. I try to maintain consistent naming. So I name components, I name my organization structure after those domain model items, and I name the components after them, and I name other components. I name the interaction components in the same way. And then when a domain element is passed as a prop, I use an instance of validation with prop types. That's definitely not something you have to do, and I know quite a few people don't use prop types anymore, but it has definitely been a helpful thing for me. And I'd like to open this up to questions.
Awesome, Aidan. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for that presentation. Yeah, if there are any questions, please post them right there on the YouTube channel, and we'll try to get them answered. Have you seen or got any feedback of any downsides to this way of modeling?
I mean, it's definitely something. So, oh, sorry, I accidentally advanced. It's something that I've had to, teach to new people that I've brought onto my team or new people that I've worked with. So, it's not a typical thing that people do. So I've had to teach people how to do it. But I found that once I do, it generally goes over well and leads to the benefits that I talked about.
Yeah, no, I think this is extremely beneficial for newcomers, and just for maintainability of the application. Having an organized mental model from the get-go does save a lot of time and productivity.
Absolutely. And then now with tools like you saw, I was using WebStorm. With tools like WebStorm, if we add something new or there's a new relationship, you can refactor the name of a component and have it update everywhere. So it makes, it's very easy these days with modern, IDE type tools to maintain the naming conventions over time without a whole lot of extra effort. So I personally don't see why there's any reason not to.
Yeah, no kidding. Big shout out to all the IDE developers, engineers who are making it easier for us.
Absolutely.
There was a question by Fabian. Question is, where do you call the model.create object?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I guess I didn't really show the slice here. So if we were looking at the list slice, it's called when I actually get the data. So in this case, I'm using sample data. So it's just kind of already, I've got it kind of already done in my initial state. But here, an example on the add action here. Anytime they add a new item, I am calling list create with just an ID and everything else is empty. But if I was fetching this data from a server, if I had a get here, or like I guess it's more of like a set. So if I had like a set where I'm calling, getting data back from a server, got state and payload lists, right? So that's what I just got. I did an asynchronous call. I got back this lists payload from a server, and now I can do state. And this is another thing I like to do. Some preferences coming through is I like to actually index in my Redux store, but I could just as easily have set it as an array. But so in this case, I can do state equals state list reduce, where I've got my accumulator and each list item, and do accumulator list ID equals list.create list, and accumulator. So it could just as easily, if I was storing stuff as an array, it could just as easily have been state equals list dot map list dot create, and now it's going to create a list for every item in there. So depending on your preferences for how you're storing data, but so whenever I get data back is when I actually call that to create them. But with the current setup, this is what it would look like.
Yeah, nice. And can you quickly just explain what does create slice do?
Yeah, so create slice is really nice. So rather than managing separate files with action types and actions and reducers, it basically it lets you put everything in one place and lets you pull things out as you need them. So in this case, create slice, you give it a name, which is what it's actually going to be registered as in the state. You give it its initial state, and then you can create under reducers. This is essentially like shorthand for actions and a reducer. So I'm creating a set action, but this action is like inclusive of its part in the reducer rather than having that giant switch statement that's typically there. So then at the end, I can export just these actions, or however you want to name them, or however you want to export. Their suggestion is with this deconstruction, you can export the actions directly. You can create selectors, and ultimately it builds all of these individual actions and their sub-reducers into a overall reducer that you can then add into your root store. So the list reducer that was exported from that file we were just in, I can add to the root reducer. So it's a really, really nice improvement over all of the boilerplate that you had to do before to get something into your store.
Yeah, so the creating 6 files days are gone. You can use this. Exactly. Nice.
Exactly.
Very nice, very nice. Any more questions? I know you mentioned WebStorm IDE, and watching you type, I see a lot of options, and it looks like types associated with those. Some of those options coming through in your code.
Oh yeah, so the Create React app Redux store comes with TypeScript. I'm just not using it here. And
got it.
Yeah, and I mean that's one. So to move forward now, if we don't have any more questions, this was an example of how you could code a domain model into your app if you're not using TypeScript. If you have an existing app without TypeScript, or you're starting a new one without TypeScript, then this is a great way to that I've found to make the domain model a first a top level citizen in your app. But if you are using TypeScript, TypeScript has its own the domain model is built into TypeScript. Yeah, so that's why Roberto is going to talk about some TypeScript next.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Aidan. And yeah, so our next topic here, presentation, will be on TypeScript. And so let me just share my screen. And so what is TypeScript? Why TypeScript? How TypeScript? Should you be spending your time, wasting your time, benefiting of your time? TypeScript. TypeScript's been around for a while now. I'm sure you heard of TypeScript in some form or another in conversations. If you're a full stack developer, you probably heard it more often than front end developers. But nonetheless, TypeScript is, gaining a lot of popularity. But I wouldn't adopt it out of popularity. Adopt it because it is a technology that will make you as a developer level up. It will better you. It will better your way of thinking about programs and how you solve problems. And most importantly, how you share and cooperate with your fellow engineers. And so this presentation is just going to be an overview of that. I was putting this together. This can easily become its own weekend workshop. There's a lot to cover with TypeScript. There's a lot of awesome examples, a lot of in-depth thinking, new vocabulary. If you've never done anything with static types, programming languages, and this is brand new to you, it's quite the leveling up that goes along with it. And so with that in mind, this presentation is just, I hope to accomplish that I tickle your curiosity into learning TypeScript and how it can help you, and not just yourself, but when you share and cooperate with other developers as well. So quick overview of the outline. Again, TypeScript is a massive domain. There's a lot to do with TypeScript. I want to just cover it quickly and give a few examples about it and how it can help you. And then I will present on the canonical to-do list, as our previous presenter also presented on a to-do list. I'm just going to follow in that footstep with TypeScript, right? And adding TypeScript with the React application, with the webpack, and spinning it up and just trying to get you to think. It's very little overhead once you get it up and running, but it can get you way ahead of your skill sets as you level up. So just to get right into it, what is TypeScript? So it's just going down the list here, right? Nothing complicated. It's an open source language. It's not shoehorned. It's not maintained by a single entity. It is a superset of JavaScript. So what that means is that you can write JavaScript and TypeScript will know exactly what you're doing, what you're writing, how to interpret what you're doing, and so on and so forth. It's superset means that JavaScript is is kind of like a subset of TypeScript. TypeScript wraps itself around JavaScript and gives you a kind of like a boost to your development. So a typical question that I get from newcomers from bootcamp is, why do I have to learn another language? And it's not, right? You cannot learn TypeScript if you don't know JavaScript. And so don't think of it as a binary choice. You don't have to choose either or, right? You can incrementally learn and then apply TypeScript. Just like if you started off in front-end development, you don't have to learn every single little thing about JavaScript, right? You have HTML, CSS, and then you have the bindings, the JavaScript bindings in the browser. And a lot of us, when we started off, that's what we did. We didn't really learn the fundamentals of prototypical inheritance and so forth, right? We learned it step by step, incrementally. It's very similar with TypeScript. It's not a binary choice. You don't have to choose yes or no here. To become a better developer, this is a way. Think of it as a ladder, a level up. You use a little bit, you sprinkle it a little bit in your programs, in your coding. As you sprinkle it, you're learning step by step the powers of what TypeScript can offer you as a developer. TypeScript validates JavaScript. So you can write JavaScript in your TypeScript and be perfectly fine, right? There's nothing's going to blow up. Nothing's going to refuse your code. What TypeScript does, it gives you an advantage to kind of help you better describe what you want, your intentions. You can write, as Aidan mentioned, your prototypes. If you don't want to use that library, and I'll get to this in the code, you can write, and if you write TypeScript, right, that becomes your model. That becomes your, and as Aidan also mentioned, it becomes also your domain model. You can type these things out, wrap them in JavaScript, and validate that your code and your model and your way of thinking about the program is like logically true. The way I think about TypeScript and the way I started off was, I took it as my own personal IDE assistant. Now, prior to TypeScript, I use VS Code. So if you use Babel, right, a lot of in VS Code and I guess Babel kind of work very well together. There's a lot of like type hinting to certain parts of your program. Is it a string? Is it a number, a Boolean? What type of function? So on and so forth. TypeScript kind of offers you all that and more. And so while you're developing your IDE and you think about your models, you think about your actions, not necessarily in your front end code, right? It could be in any program, back end and front end. It helps you. It is there to help you. If you don't need it, you don't use it. If you want to use it, it's there for you. And so I never took a deep dive into TypeScript. I think my deep dive has been over, a year's worth of incrementally learning TypeScript in the code base, in my side projects, and at work. And so with that encouragement, I hope that you take this as it's not a binary choice. It's not a yes or a no with this, right? Take it, learn it, apply it as you progressively grow into your position as a developer. It's also very important, as Aidan mentioned, like what happens when you leave a company? What happens when you onboard someone new? Or maybe you go on vacation, or maybe your application is 100,000 lines of code. And it's very difficult as human beings to maintain all that knowledge in your brain, right? If you leave the company, all that knowledge goes with you. And so as another developer comes and takes his place and looks at the application, wow, right? We all heard these types of stories. What TypeScript offers is a more of a writing assistant. So as you onboard onto a new project, you leave, you go somewhere else, and you onboard there, what have you. If a project is using TypeScript, think about it as you're a monk in one of these 1500 churches. You're sitting there with a candlestick and you're reading through some manuscripts. And as you read through it, the language, even though you quite don't understand the vocabulary and the grammar, TypeScript gives you that advantage of like hovering over functions, hovering over objects, hovering over models. Your static code kind of comes to life. It gives you a reference point. Like, hey, this model does this. This model has these types of methods, this function, this object, this classes, right? It makes that static page come alive. It gives you a bunch of hints and it's supposed to assist you in your development. Not just you, but right, when you work in teams and you cooperate in a team, it helps others as well, which is very important because we're not really writing for ourselves, we're writing for others. And so I want to get into the examples because there's a lot to cover, but I don't want to confuse you if you've never seen TypeScript. I don't want to confuse you in the complexity of it, because to start off, it's not really complex. It's rather simple. And so I want to just show you basic examples of how it can help you right now learning it, and how you can just add it into your code base, and why you want to add it to your code base in your projects today. So before getting to the code base, I want to share the kind of like the reference points of resources, right? There's a TypeScript web page dedicated to explaining everything, every small detail about it. The documentation's awesome. This is where my first trip was when I started learning about TypeScript. And so you can go ahead and read it through here and figure out what is TypeScript, why you want to use it. So let's see the docs. There's again, documentation's awesome. The getting started. If you're a new programmer, click through these links. If you're TypeScript for JavaScript programmers, TypeScript for Java and C# programmers, right? If you're coming into if you're coming into JavaScript, if you're a functional programmer, right? It has a lot of good introductions into TypeScript from multiple programming perspectives. And so if you identify yourself as one of these perspectives or kind of like paradigms, functional programming, object-oriented programming, these are good articles to read on how to orient yourself about thinking about TypeScript. I know a lot of people don't like JavaScript, right? It's full of warts, it's this and that, it's disgusting language, whatever, right? But for some reason, they find TypeScript very approachable. And so I encourage anyone to come in here, and if you still have doubts about it, to at least click in here and try to get a good understanding of what TypeScript is and it isn't, and how it's very different from just regular JavaScript. Essentially, every I guess a lot of JavaScript libraries are implementing TypeScript. And so part of a developer, right, either front end or back end, and you're using Express, you're using Koa, you're using Happy, whatever server framework you want to use in the back, or just plain Node.js, right? A lot of these frameworks that we know today were not written in TypeScript. But it doesn't really matter because TypeScript is a superset, right? You just wrap your JavaScript in TypeScript, and you get all the benefits associated with that. And so there is this web page, definitely typed, and you want to know if the library that you're using right now exposes types, so that when you develop, you just your IDE comes alive with like all the methods and what have you, all the benefits associated with the library that TypeScript kind of like brings out. And so if you want to look for that, right, you look in the type search and you look for that particular library. And so does Express.js have types? It does. Does Koa.js have types? Well, there you go, types. What about, I think it's called Immer? Does Immer have types? Well, I'm not really sure. You can click into it and investigate and do the research, but I'm sure a lot of these popular libraries do have types. React, yes, types. Redux, right? A lot of these libraries that we have or we want, that we use on a daily basis, have types already built inside of them. If you're unaware of them, come here and check it out. Figure out if they are. If they're not, feel free to make a pull request to the greater community to get these libraries up to spec, to expose these types, because it really is beneficial for newcomers to, if you're working on a open source library project, it's beneficial to have types, because it makes the overhead of onboarding new developers to help with your project that much easier. So a lot of benefits here with using types or static typing. And so coming to full circle with React, right? Aidan mentioned create React app. There's already a part of it or flavor of it that you can, hey, let's make a template and start using TypeScript associated with it right off the bat. And so again, I think the community has done a really good job on onboarding new developers, or JavaScript developers in general, into this TypeScript ecosystem. So again, I'm pretty sure a lot of your favorite libraries have these types already inside of them. The next step will be getting a lot of JavaScript developers to start writing or writing programs with TypeScript. And so one thing that I found very, very helpful, and please take a look at it, it's called the React TypeScript cheat sheets. For this presentation, if you go through this, right, it's very, 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 very definitive. It's very exact. The steps are very incremental, and it takes a while to go through all this stuff. So I won't be doing that. What I'll be doing is providing an overview of how everything kind of just fits together. But if you want to learn the details of React with TypeScript, this is a good webpage to begin, right? And of course, also the TypeScript webpage. And I'm sure there's a lot of Medium articles out there, or blogs in general, that provide a lot of tutorials on how to get started with TypeScript. So that being said, let's get to some code. So the first step I want to walk through real quick is just a very bare bones JavaScript canonical add function example. In this case, we have a function called add. It takes two parameters, which I named num1, num2, and it returns the addition of these two numbers. I assign these numbers 5 and 7.8, right? Very basic, very understandable, nothing of a great leap here. And so jumping over to the terminal, right? And the end result here is 12.8. So what happens when I want to make this a TypeScript? I essentially change the extension to TS, right? This tells VS Code that I have a TypeScript file. And with that TypeScript file, I want you to implement or apply TypeScript rules and formalities over my file. And immediately I see a red squiggly line over my parameters of the function. And so this is TypeScript hinting at you, hey, something's not right here. You want to use TypeScript? Okay, let's use it. And what happens is that there's this type of any. And what that means is that this number, this parameter, it could be any type. It could be a Boolean, it could be a string, it could be an object, it could be a function, so on and so forth, right? And TypeScript here is saying, hey, be aware that these functions or these parameters of these functions can be anything, which kind of defeats the purpose, right? You want to be specific. Your functions want to have particular parameter types. One thing I forgot to mention is with any JavaScript tool, build tool, what have you, there's always going to be a configuration file. And so I have a configuration file called tsconfig.json. And this configuration file, think about it as your webpack configuration. Think about it as your ESLint configuration. If you use post CSS configuration, right? This is configuration files that TypeScript will use to evaluate your code. There's a list of rules that it does. And for the focus of this presentation, the important one or important options are target and module. And so what TypeScript is going to do is going to take your your TypeScript code, and it's going to spit out JavaScript, right? Your typical JavaScript code that we all love and hate and that we write, right? That's all TypeScript is going to do. It's going to evaluate some code, and then at the end of the day, it's going to spit it out JavaScript. And that what it spits out is what we call a target. So in the configuration, we have this target. What does that mean? It means what kind of, I guess, what version of JavaScript do you want to spit out, to compile to? Here I have ES6, but it's only a matter of like, if you hover over it, you give all the options associated with it. So if you're working with something with like IE9, for example, right? IE9 browsers probably can't run async await, right? So your target, but you want to write, as a developer, you want to write static. You want to run your JavaScript code in an IE9 browser because of job requirements. TypeScript allows you to do that, right? It allows you to pick the target that you want. It's very similar to what Babel does, where you pick a browser or versions of browsers that you want to output your JavaScript into. So as a developer, you can write code using the latest and greatest ES6, 2020, 2021, ES Next, so on and so forth. But rest assured that when TypeScript runs and compiles to JavaScript, it compiles down to a JavaScript that is runnable in a browser that your business needs to support, right? And so there's a lot of configuration options here. Again, you can take a day and many hours going through every single one of these options. But going back to this issue of any, that if our function parameters are going to so basically if our function parameters are not typed, we get this squiggly line. It's we're kind of defeating the purpose of TypeScript. We want to type our parameters. We want to tell the function what types of values that it can receive. And so TypeScript is telling us it doesn't make any sense. You're trying to use TypeScript, but you're saying any. You're not really doing anything here. This is optional, right? If you go into the configurations, you can actually call that out. Yeah, here we go, right? All right, we lost connectivity there. So this option tells TypeScript to ignore that issue, to ignore that problem. I still want to compile my JavaScript. And the command here to compile your TypeScript into JavaScript is tsc. You specify the file that you want to spit out. TypeScript takes that JavaScript file, because it's literally just JavaScript. There's nothing fancy going on, and it spits out a file for you. And that's it. It took your JavaScript and it spit out more JavaScript. It took your TypeScript and it spits out JavaScript. You can write JavaScript in your TypeScript files, and at the end result, you still get JavaScript, right? Nothing really changed. It just took away some lines and what have you. So let's just add some types to it. Hey, you know what? I'm going to make this parameter a string. Oh, sorry, a number, and this parameter also a number, right? And now I'm going to add, instead of a number, let's just say, as an example, I'm going to add a string together. And almost immediately, TypeScript hears, again, to assist us, hey, this number 2 is not of type number, right? This parameter that we specified up here as a number, and TypeScript is hinting at us like, hey, something's wrong. And so if this was not TypeScript, let's just call it a JavaScript, and I'll remove these types. And this is part of our production code base and whatnot. And we ran that function. We get this value of 57.8. Hey, it looks like a number, so it must be good to go, right? And so these are the little hints in a massive code base that can save you a lot of headaches. And so with TypeScript, let's just flip that back to a TypeScript. Add these types to it. The type number. TypeScript tells me, hey, this has to be a number. Okay, so leave that as a number. Everything looks good. And I'm going to compile that to JavaScript. Takes it a few seconds, and we should get an output of, there it is. And so you see that typing is missing here, because that typing is not JavaScript. So we write it as a superset. TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. We wrap our code with these types. We sprinkle it in our code base. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter about the JavaScript, because TypeScript is going to compile down to JavaScript. And your JavaScript is JavaScript. It has all the ECMAScript rules and grammars associated for a valid JavaScript. And if I was doing this with like IE 9 or something, right, and I chose my compile, my target to be something like ES3, your TypeScript is going to be a little bit different. If you notice, my const vocabulary changed to vars, right? ES6, ES5. So that's pretty much what's happening here. So in the old days, I was looking through some of my old code and trying to, this is code written probably like in 2012 or something back then. And we had a very strict, or 2014, we had a very strict way of convention. So as programmers, we have to follow a certain convention, and every development shop had their own conventions. You put all your variables at top and all your functions at the bottom. Every callback, it's going to have if the first parameter is going to be an error, and the second parameter can be whatever else is left. And at the very end, you always have a return that follows some kind of a convention as well. And so before the IDEs become what they are today, you as a developer had to learn how to write in a conventional way, which was highly dependent on a development shop. And that was because when bugs appeared or when new features were added, the only way to keep a consistent development flow or syntax for understanding was making sure that every developer followed the same convention. And so that's pretty much it. If you didn't know what the address function was doing or what it was, right, you had to go and where it's being used. It's very different experience as it is today, where you can just hover over it and out pops out, right? Your functions become very dynamic. And so like right here, right, we have this hints, VS Code in the background, even though JavaScript is throwing us a bunch of hints. And so TypeScript is there to help us with our coding for our development. And it's through these little bits of pieces of incremental implementation of TypeScript that gets us there. And so one of the other things too, talking about domain modeling or models in general, right? We have this example here in JavaScript of a user model, and I'm going to go ahead and import it into this file, into my TypeScript file. And so we'll see what kind of affordances this gives us. Okay, so I got that. Okay, great. And let's just say I want to use the user model, and I want to use ID for something, right? Now, this isn't telling us anything. We're importing a JavaScript function to the TypeScript function, and if we build this out, it's going to function, and it's going to work. And so that's it. You get it. But we all know that if we run this function, there's going to be an error, right? And that error is, oops. Of course. Exports is not defined. They require, well, I got to figure that one out, but we see that it's just JavaScript. There's when you compile it down, the TypeScript goes away, but we know that immediately if in this example, we see that the ID is not capitalized, right? But our ID is not really helping us there. And so if we make this into a TypeScript, just change the file into a TypeScript file. Is it? There we go. So just by changing that file into a TypeScript file, TypeScript kind of kicks in. and it's telling us, hey, you know that the object with a capital I and a D, yeah, that doesn't exist, right? Again, it's hinting at us like, hey, you're using an object with an attribute that is non-existent. And just use a little bit of your imagination and just imagine a massive code base. And you're importing a bunch of files, a bunch of libraries, and someone makes this mistake. And you push it up to into production, and bam. Trying to find that a bug, you know, it could take a couple hours, couple days, and maybe 2 or 3 other developers. With TypeScript, almost immediately, hey, this object that you're trying to use doesn't make any sense. Okay, so one other thing too is like, hey, you know what? I want TypeScript to, I want to create a model, an interface model with the same stuff, but I'm going to specify the type. And then on top of that, I want to export this. So here's the type. I'm going to use this type, this model that has this specific types associated with them. So that when I come down here, not only do I, oh, sorry, I forgot. This object now is going to follow the model that I defined using conventional names, user model, right? Coming here, type hinting, it gives me the stuff that this function has or this object has available to it, and that's the one I want. Now, I can easily create an object here with the same stuff, right? First name, Danny, and ID, whatever. And so happens I'm just going to increase my parameter load on my function, right? And I want to do some deconstruction of this random object. And so hovering over this error is pretty much telling me like they're not being used. All right, so let's just get rid of that real quick. First name, last name, okay, right? I can compile this and my job is done here. So what TypeScript offers is like, hey, you know what? If we use our user model type and we apply it to this object, immediately TypeScript evaluates our code and says, hold up, you're trying to use something that doesn't make any sense, right? And so we can come back here and try to fix this up. And so our model here, right? It's like these small hints that make it a lifesaver, especially when you're moving into a new code base that is massive and you're trying to ramp up. And we can also put, I mean, depending on how you do your TypeScripting, you can put it on the model, you can put it down there, you know, what have you. And so we just have to make sure that the parameters are matching the type user model. But that's essentially, in a nutshell, one perspective of what TypeScript can offer you. And so I want to show you the to-do app. Let me so it's very similar to, well, it's similar in concept, but it's really, really The to-do app has no CSS in it. It's a very bare bones React application that just displays a to-do list. You add and you subtract. Come on. You were working an hour ago. All right, so I don't know what's going on here. Oh, here we go. So very basic to do, bare bones. You add stuff to it. There's like 3 components total. New to do, your entrance to the app. But before we get into that, I wanted to walk you real quick through the webpack and how you can set your webpack up to this. So a webpack, the new version coming out, and I guess the latest of 4 point something, they gave the option, or they encouraged the option of using this folder called the .webpack, where you kind of place all your configuration inside of it, and also encourage you to split your development environments. And so that's what we've done here. This is just for purely development. I didn't make a production one. It's just development. But the focus here is just like we've been doing with Babel Loader, right? You want to compile your JavaScript into a version of JavaScript that runs in multiple browsers. Prior to that, we have this thing called Awesome TypeScript Loader. Now, Awesome TypeScript Loader is very similar to kind of like a TS loader. It offers some advantages and some configurations that you may want to look for if you're going this route. And so I just use Awesome TypeScript Loader. It's a subset, or it's a extension of TS loader. But if you understand how Webpack is working, it's going to go through your application program, look for all those .ts or .tsx files, and it's going to compile them first with TypeScript. And then that results in JavaScript. It's going to take that JavaScript, that TypeScript compiled, and it's going to shove it into the Babel loader. And then the Babel loader is going to take that JavaScript and transpile it once again into the JavaScript that you want to support in the multiple browsers that your company needs to support. And that's it. Just adding this to your Webpack configuration enables TypeScript. Now, there's a few things that you want to do and install as far as packages, but as far as functionality and getting out the door, this is pretty much it. There's a lot of stuff coming down with the new Webpack 5 that is challenging. There's the new kind of like a React refresh, kind of like when you hot reloading, right, has been altered, has been changed. So you have to get reacquainted with that, which is a fun debugging experience. But other than that, if you know bare bones Webpack, you're out of the, you know pretty much how to get started with TypeScript in React. And so once we get our Webpack wired up, right, we can come in here and basically change our names, JSX files to .tsx files, our .js files into .ts files, and we're off to the races. And so what does that kind of like give us. And so a quick walkthrough of that. Let me so what that gives us, right? If you're thinking about models, it's very good to, again, I'm not going to build this for myself. I'm going to build it for my future self and other developers. We can come in here and define our models as these types, as these interfaces, so that we can import them wherever they're going to be used, and provide, and TypeScript will provide the right hints for us to implement them correctly. And so it's not just tied to these models, but if you think about parameters and your classes and your functions, right? They're pretty much everywhere. So you can use them everywhere. And so if you want to substitute your prop types for these new TypeScript types, right? And they'll pretty much work the same way. They're there to give you a check, to give you a hint of saying like, hey, you're using this component wrong. This component is missing this. Or if you want to know what your component of like what kind of functions and methods your component affords, you know, this is the route to go. And so in this example, right, this new to do is when you click that button. We have here TypeScript. We're notifying TypeScript like we're going to use this thing called FC. FC is just short for function component. You hover over it and it gives you the typing. Okay, so I'm using a function component here. And that function component is going to take a prop property of new to do props, which is this thing basically up here, right? So this component is going to take is a React function component that will take props of these types. And so if we look at our global application, we are importing these two components. TypeScript is doing its magic underneath, and it's kind of like hinting at it that something is wrong. And I'll walk through real quick on how to fix it. But this is happening because TypeScript is doing all that kind of like static checking behind the scenes. And this kind of comes into like, okay, so you know, it's not limited use state, right? It's not limited to just React components. Everything in React can take a type, can take a type definition. You can specify exactly what a function is going to do, what a function needs, what a component does, what a component needs. And this being an example of use state here is that to-do model, right? But it's an array. It's an array of to-dos. And that's kind of like the way TypeScript kind of, the syntax of TypeScript. And so hovering over these values or parameters, it kind of hints at you, right? Hey, this is a dispatch that comes from the React library, but it's a to-do model of an arrays. Again, there's a lot of hinting going on, but in our case, we want to use to-do list. And so how can we get that happening? Right now, to-dos is missing, it's empty. And I just want to quickly show like how you can incrementally build on this. So let's just get started real quick. So I want to use my to-do list, and my to-do list is going to be displaying the list, and I want to have a button on it that deletes the list, right? Add to do, and there's this delete button here. So I'm going to come down here and just going to start naming this to-do list. Yeah. Now, so we're getting hinting here. What's going on here? Okay, so For the to-do list, it's a function that returns void, meaning returns nothing. Okay. You want it to return JSX, but just following. So we're going to tell TypeScript that this is a function. So React comes with typings, right? So what that means is it gives you all the stuff, kind of like introspection. It gives you all the kind of like available methods and and attributes associated with the top level React. And so we can see here, we can scroll through it. If we're a newcomer to React, this really helps you because if you haven't memorized all the possible functions and methods of React, right, it immediately displays to you options. And so in this case, we want to type out our component. So I want to use something called I think it's FC. So I'm just going to go off what we did last. It's going to go off what the new to do. So FC, this component is going to take some props. And it's going to return, like I said, it's going to be a list of items that come through the to-dos. So right off the bat, something that I can do for those of us that have this in our code bases everywhere, you know, there's nothing absolutely wrong with this, right? But you don't need to do this anymore. If you're using TypeScript, some kind of array and some kind of delete, right? There's probably litter all over our code bases. But when you're using TypeScript, the substitute for this is to create these models, these interfaces. And these interfaces are going to, well, interface between function calls. So instead of having a to-do list prop types, you create your model to-do list props. And I want this model, I want my component to have it like an items and a right, on delete to do, right? And these items are going to take an array of to-dos, and this function is going to take this function that's already written out for me. And then TypeScript here kind of comes in and says, hey, you're trying to do this thing here, but it's not really, it's not existent. Okay, cool. Give me a second. I want to come in here. Okay, so my items, my to-do items, they're going to be objects. And these objects are going to, usually, if you look at the, I'm being a little quick here, but my to-do model is simple, an ID and a text. So, I want an array of that. I want an array of that, and that's going to be an array. On top of that, I want a function that takes in an ID, which is a string, and it spits out, well, nothing. It returns a void. So it's very similar to JavaScript functions, but these are TypeScript functions, like if you want to look at it that way. And in return, you define your types and you return your types. And so on top of that, so I'm going to make sure that my component takes these parameters inside of it. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the old school way. And we see that the squiggly line went away. You hover over to-do list, you see that everything's looking good. It is a React function component with properties from the to-do list props. Okay, so good. On to the next thing. I want to have this props, right? So now I take props, and I have these two options associated with them, or three options, but the ones of concern to us are the items, which are the to-dos, and the function when you click on delete. And I like to do destructuring, so we'll go ahead and do that from your props. And then, of course, the inevitable interpolation using maps. So I'm going to get a list of to-dos, to-do items, and I'm going to return back JSX. And so it's going to be a list. Check. Let's go ahead and just write our name of I guess to do. What is it? Oh yeah, sorry, text. We're going to have a key. Right. Our list contain keys, and then our button's going to be a big fat delete. Part of that, though, is a function, the onClick event, which let's just throw in there on delete to do, which takes a parameter of ID. Cool. Now we're getting something else here. We're getting a squiggly line. Again, this is TypeScript letting us know that, hey, we probably have the right idea here. It looks pretty obvious what our intention is, but there's something minute that is wrong. And you can push this out code, right? You can compile this through your Babel and have it display in your browser. And it's only through this interaction of testing that you get this, hey, my to-do button on delete button is not working right. So what TypeScript here is kind of, again, hinting at you. It's saying like the function that you put in is not really what we're expecting for a event. So obviously the fix here is using a lambda. And so again, TypeScript, being an assistant, is there to assist you on your programming. And so everything looks green, green, green. There's no red anywhere. And so, in theory, now that everything is set up, everything is done, it should just work, right? TypeScript is just like, all right, we're all green here. And hopefully this won't take as long as the first time it is, but it looks like it will. Oh, there we go. Okay, so very similar to last time. You get delete, delete. And again, and so these are just examples of a small to-do application with types and how, from this very minimal perspective, how TypeScript can help you. Now, before I close up, I want to show you something else. I want to show you more of a complicated mess. I wouldn't say mess. It's just brand new to me. Working in an application that involves a lot of AWS. As a developer, I can spend hours and days studying the AWS API, memorizing their methods, learning from examples on how to implement these things. What happens when you use TypeScript, though, as a developer, right? I spend most of my time reading the code, which is what you want to understand the stack, to understand the application, to understand the domain. And when it's properly typed, right? If you write a library and it's properly typed, it helps me as a developer go through it. It helps me as a developer go through applications that are using your library in unimaginable ways, in very complex ways. And I can sit here and go through it and iterate over it, right? and see how TypeScript is hinting at stuff so that I can, right, improve my understanding of the code base. And so this is an application that uses, it's kind of like Amazon libraries. I'm not an Amazon guy. The small, minute details that Amazon kind of go over me. But as you can see, a lot of the stuff pretty much pops out once you start using, once I guess the TypeScript kind of comes out and helps. And this is just one example, but you can easily see how it can extend out to multiple things. It's always good to read other people's, how they write their type definitions, how they write their classes. TypeScript, gives you that that assistance. And so going through a lot of this stuff, and it's really, really, really complicated at first, right? It helps you bounce around. It helps you understand what are these attributes? How can I use these attributes? I don't remember this Postgres stack, what it does and how to use it, so on and so forth. But so TypeScript does give you that advantage of like, hey, you know what? I'm going to hold your hand and we're going to walk through this step by step, function by function, attribute by attribute. And it takes a lot of the overhead of memorizing things to a T. You let TypeScript, assist you. And so that's why I really like TypeScript. I really encourage developers to write TypeScript because it helps other developers like myself who will eventually interact with your libraries, with your applications. Think about your fellow coworkers who just joined your team, right? And you're trying to maintain or even to extend your application. Having a common understanding, having a common vocabulary, as Aidan pointed out, is very important. And so, I mean, that's pretty much for the presentation. I really want to maybe in the future give a workshop and go way more in depth of the many types and advantages of TypeScript. So if you're interested, please let me know. Hopefully this pandemic will bring us back together in a room sometime soon. And if not, and there's a lot of interest in it, I can do it also virtually next month or in November. But definitely let me know. TypeScript is, for myself, a very, it makes me feel like engineering, there's more to it. Static types versus dynamic typing. It's great to engage in the conversations. It's great to understand why those conversations are happening, different perspectives of programming. And so I'm glad that JavaScript has evolved and there's other millions and billions of other people looking at this and saying, yeah, you know what, this is a good idea. Is TypeScript the answer to everything? Probably not. But as a developer and you're trying to level up, this is probably a good direction to head in. It's a good guide. With that being said, is there any questions I can help answer? Yes, definitely a Vim user. Vim bindings on VS Code. With that being said, I mean, if there's no more questions, I really appreciate everyone's time. I do have a list of resources here to help guide you in your development. I hope this was just a inkling of your curiosity to go into at least take a look at TypeScript. Remember, it's not a binary choice. It's think about your fellow developers that you work with. If you're doing open source, think about how other developers will use it and how you can help them understand and even onboard them a lot quicker without you hand-holding them in every file. With that being said, if there's no more questions, I really appreciate everyone's time. Please stay safe out there and see you next month. And if you do have a idea for a presentation, you want to give a presentation, let me know. We'll set something up. And a great thank you to Aidan for his presentation. Domain modeling is extremely important. It was great refresher on how it does not only apply to back-end development. Domain modeling definitely applies to front-end development, and it's great to see examples of how you can apply it with React, Redux, and just UIs in general. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.